I've been doing it for years. I absolutely love tube rolling. I've gone through hundreds of tubes and I've tube rolled in a lot of different gear. Today, I found a sweet spot that I absolutely love. My rig sounds exactly like I want it to sound for the music genres that I love listening to the most. So today I decided I'm going to share with you guys a little bit of experience and advice that I learned over time. It doesn't mean that I'm better, that I know more. It just means that I've made a bunch of mistakes already. So, an advantage of tube rolling, well, simple. You can tailor the sound to the characteristics that you like. You can play with the highs, the mids, the lows, the soundstage, holographic effect. Disadvantages that you can expect from embarking on a tube rolling adventure is it costs money, it takes time, and often it can make things worse. Tube rolling and voicing of an amplifier. So, amplifiers are voiced by their designers, meaning they select a certain set of components, capacitors, resistors, so on and so forth, that all often have a sonic character to them in order to achieve a sound that the designer is looking for. There's a combination of two things here. There's a combination of measurements that they make sure that their levels are good, the gain is good, the distortion is good, frequency response is good. But a lot of designers, especially the good ones, are also going to tune a little bit by ear so that they can get the sound that they're going for. So the voicing that was set up was done with a certain set of tubes in mind because the tubes that are selected by the designer are not always selected for their musical character. Let me explain. Sometimes these tubes are picked because of global factors or business factors. So availability is one of them. Can they get these tubes in the quantity that they need so they can supply the demand of their amplifier of the cell of their amplifiers? Then you have the origin of the tube. Well, these days getting tubes from Russia is a little tricky. What about the quality and longevity of the tubes? Right? They don't want to have to deal with frustrated customers, so they want to make sure that they can get tubes that will last a certain amount of time so that people don't have to worry about it. So when you factor these parameters in when you're picking your tubes, oftentimes tubes that are selected is a balance between the sonic character that they have and these real life parameters to run a business. So the passive components that end up being picked once the manufacturer knows what tubes he's going to include as stock in his amplifier. Well, the components that are picked in a circuit are often going to be picked to complement the sonic characteristic that the tubes that are stock are going to have. For instance, if a tube is a little bit bright, they're probably going to pick capacitors in the output stage that might emphasize a little bit of the mids, warmth, and so on, or vice versa. So, an amplifier that's voiced with specific parts in order to color the sound or to counteract the tubes that are used could play a factor in how some tubes are going to sound good or worse if you tube roll in these amplifiers. Now, I get it. It's hard for you to predict these things. As a matter of fact, you're going to tube roll and find out. Now, that brings me to tube rolling and heavily colored amplifiers. Some output stages in amplifiers are made specifically to heavily color the sound so that the sound is tailored to exactly a sonic character that the designer or the company wants for the amplifier so that it can be maintained and consistent over the amplifiers over time. And when it's this colored, when things are very colored in the output stage, this could mean that these amplifiers will sound at 90% the same regardless of the tubes you put in them. This happens. Some amps don't sound hardly any different if you tube roll, let's say, tubes that are preamp nature, or if you roll the rectifier in them. Basically, there's going to be some differences in these amplifiers, but the differences are going to be very, very subtle. The next factor in tube rolling that I found that we have to consider is the amplifier using a negative feedback? So negative feedback is used in a lot of amplifiers, especially amplifiers with high current. This is a way to ensure that there's a stable output and reduce of distortion and managing the gain of an amplifier. But similar to a highly colored output stage, like I was talking before, having a very high amount of negative feedback, so a very high voltage, this will reduce the impact of tube rolling. Then you have tube rectification. When rolling two rectifiers are no different in their dependencies from other types of tubes in an amplifier to the circuit design, component selection in the output stage, negative feedback versus no negative feedback. All of these things, all of these things will impact how much character you're going to feel when you roll a tube rectifier. Now, it's important to understand though that you can still and probably will have an impact in rolling a rectifier, even if the amplifier's output stage or is highly colored or has a lot of negative feedback. In the sense that if you use a very high quality rectifier, high quality that I means that uses very high purity of materials to maximize the flow of electrons, so that the conversion of current that the rectifier does is done in the best possible way. Well, that's only going to mean that all the components in the amplifier are being fed better current. So even an amplifier with a lot of negative current that is a negative feedback that is applied, well, a high quality rectifier can still improve the sonic quality, although it's not going to play much on the tonal balance. Because in tube rolling, we want to play with the tonal balance. Remember, sometimes you want to emphasize the mids, you want to increase the bass, you want to add sparkle in the highs. Well, in the case of a high amount of negative feedback, you're not going to get that from a rectifier. But by putting a high quality rectifier in, you can improve the overall intensity of the sound, aka it's going to make it seem like your speakers sing more. Then there's a type of amplifiers really where tube rolling is often felt a little bit more. So single-ended, no negative feedback amplifiers, in my experience, I felt a lot of the sonic impacts of tube rolling, whether it's pre-tubes, voltage tubes, power tubes, or the rectifier. It's actually, you're going to feel those sonic changes. Depending on the tubes you put in there, it's going to play a little bit with the tonal balance. You can have tubes that will significantly improve the bass energy. Some tubes will improve the warmth in the mids. Some tubes will improve the level of transparency in the holographic effect of the soundstage and its three-dimensionality. So all of them, whether it's a rectifier, power tube, preamp tubes, even voltage tubes that drive the power tubes, in a single-ended amp with no negative feedback, usually you'll feel it. Again, could be dependent on the output stage. If the output stage is heavily colored and adds a lot of noise or distortion, you might not. And you'll feel that with a single-ended, no feedback design, or even a push-pull with a small amount of negative feedback current. You'll feel the difference if you're matching the right speakers with your amp. Because the importance of matching your amp and your speakers, in my opinion, is probably the most important aspect of any hi-fi rig. I'm not saying that the source is not important. It's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you have a bad match between your amplifier and your speaker, no source, no cables, no clean power is going to fix it. It'll never sing. It'll never be present in the room. Here's some tips. Now, any of these tips will have exceptions to the rule. Absolutely. So this is just a little bit of guideline that I learned. So a negative feedback amplifier with high current, let's say over 100 watts, this will tend to pair better with a low impedance speaker and low sensitivity speaker, let's say a 4 ohm speaker under 88 dB of sensitivity. Then a negative feedback amplifier with low current, so let's say under 100 watts. This is debatable. I get it. It's a freaking video, man. Don't lose your mind. So negative feedback amplifier, low current, under 100 watts. This is where I find that medium sensitivity speakers, either 4 ohms or 8 ohms, but in the 88 to 92 decibel range, will tend to sound better. Now, there's other factors to consider here. Keep in mind how many drivers there are, the configuration, the configuration of the crossover and the parts in the crossover. Then you have amps that have no negative feedback, but output a lot of current, but in a no negative feedback, I'll classify high current as over 20 watts. So over 20 watts in this case, remember, no negative feedback. Mid sensitivity and some high sensitivity speakers that use crossovers, so a two-way, or three-way, or four-way, um, will sound a little bit better. I'm generally talking about an 8 ohm speaker here in the 88 to maybe 94 decibel in sensitivity. Then we go to no negative feedback amps that are low current, mostly single ended stuff. This is where a high sensitivity full range driver, so you're talking about one driver here, with a very basic crossover, if any, could be direct tie to the driver, which would be 8 or 16 ohms in the 92 to 100 plus dB of sensitivity. That will tend to give you a great result. Because the higher the sensitivity is of the speaker, the more the sensitivity is going to reproduce artifacts, distortion, and issues. So if you're building an amplifier or acquiring an amplifier that is no negative feedback but high current, if there's any flaws in the design or lack of quality in the components, you're going to have distortion, and your high sensitivity driver is going to let you know about those issues. You're going to hear them. It'll be very audible. Whereas a low sensitivity speaker needs more current to sing, but is less subject to actually repeating some of the distortion or artifacts or issues that could come as a result of a bad design or bad components. But you need current, lots of current. And to make sure that you don't have distortion in a very high current output, this is where the negative feedback becomes important. All right. That's it for today. I really hope you guys enjoyed this. I tried to make it as short as possible. And now I am going to go and enjoy my cigar. Have a good day. Maybe I should summarize what I just said on screen so that anyone can just skip to it. Beautiful, beautiful.